I came to Brandon Sanderson's books relatively late in the piece. My husband likes the Wheel of Time series. I haven't really been able to get into that, although thanks to the audiobooks, I'm partway through book 3 now. My husband suggested to me a while back that since I like reading so much, I should try Brandon Sanderson's books because he's popular, a lot of people say he's good, and he seems to be consistently praised and good for his writing. I was pretty dubious because, to be honest, I've never really been a huge fan of long, complex, epic fantasy. Unless it's done really well, it can come across as having too many dumb, made-up words and places, quest tropes. And although as a kid I was a huge fan of the Belgariad, and I'm a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, I was just a bit wary after having had some not very good experiences reading series like Dragonlance, Terry Goodkind, or Terry Goodkind, and his S&M weirdness. The humour of Terry Pratchett and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, while funny for me in snippets, generally flew past my head. In recent years, I've really loved the Expanse series and books. I've read a lot of young adult fantasy, like Leigh Bardugo's books and the like, but I've pretty much avoided diving back into fantasy. Probably my last foray into popular fantasy was reading George R.R. Martin's books, but like many fans, I read up to the point where he'd written, and given that it doesn't look like he's ever going to finish it, it wasn't really the most satisfying experience, especially when the series overtook the books and then did a really terrible job. The first Brandon Sanderson work I read was The Emperor's Soul because it was either a cheapie or a freebie on Audible one day, and although it didn't change my life, I remember at the time I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very well written, and it was intriguing, different, and thought-provoking. Enough that I thought, I think I'm going to try to read a little bit more because this seems interesting to me. I read Mistborn Era 1 next, and my embarrassing confession is that I didn't love Vin as much as I wanted to. I'll probably put that in another section. But the point is, I didn't love the characters as much as I should have, but the writing and the world was incredibly interesting to me overall. So although I didn't like Vin's romance with Elend because it was very blah, I really enjoyed her relationship with the Condra, which I found written very well. And that's not just because I'm a dog lover. And there were just so many really interesting elements about the world that Brandon Sanderson had created. Sometimes he goes a bit over the top in his world building and description, but sometimes it's so effortless that it's very immersive and it just pulls you in. Then I read book 1 of Era 2 with what I would describe as extremely wary skepticism. And I honestly didn't like the first part, but by the end of the first book, I was hooked. I was very shocked that Sanderson had subverted my expectations about where romances would go in that novel. I was also really shocked and impressed at the complete change in style and genre, while still maintaining the overarching themes of Scadrial and the magic system that he had created in Era 1. I'm also a total sucker for westerns, and I really love Wayne and Steris so much it hurts. I know I'm in the minority there because I think I'm supposed to like Marasi the most, but there you go. Embarrassingly, I will confess that at that point, I'd barely noticed Hoyd, even though I had read several Sanderson novels. So I'm probably not the most observant reader out there. So I think by that point, you could say that I was a low-key and cautiously optimistic Brandon Sanderson fan. And I was really thrilled that I'd found a writer that was not just good, but so consistently good. Because you know how it is when you find a writer you like, and then you go back and you read all their other stuff, and it's either not as good or it's just really bad. And sometimes it's not easy to compartmentalize, and that can bleed back and kind of affect your enjoyment of the books that you did enjoy. Fortunately, that wasn't what I was finding here. I was reading more, and I was liking what I was reading. I suddenly started understanding why so many of his fans had been willing to shell out so much money for his 2022 Kickstarter without even knowing what the hell the books were that he was about to release. I did think it was really strange that they were willing to buy books that they knew nothing about. As one of the fans who was anticipating The Lost Metal being the fourth book in the Era 2 Mistborn series, in the interim, I decided to go and read some of his other works. So I read the Skyward series. This is where I really started upgrading myself to being much more of a Brandon Sanderson fan. And the Skyward series is incredibly immersive. As I found with Mistborn, I found the main character of Spencer to be pretty annoying. He has a habit of writing fairly perfect in some ways, but flawed in other ways, but fundamentally pretty selfish and self-absorbed female characters when they're the lead. And I find that a little bit jarring. But I still really loved it, and I liked all of the wide cast of characters. I loved Doomslug. I really enjoyed the narration, even though normally I don't like narrators that have such a strong American accent, but I felt like it really worked for the Skyward series. It was just really enjoyable, and I have to confess that I even liked Cytonic, even though I know that a lot of people didn't like that novel much. At the same time I was reading all of the Skyward series, I also started the Reckoners series. At first, echoes of the Amazon series The Boys distracted me, but I was able to, in a way, put aside that and just enjoy it as, a young adult version of The Boys. The premise was interesting. I didn't like the main characters as much. I found them really annoying. Like a lot of people, I don't think Sanderson's great at romance. The two female leads in the Steelheart series and Lux, their names are Megan and Paige, and I found them essentially the same to one another. They're smart, sassy, defensive, obnoxious, coming from a hurt background, and in turn they're pretty similar to Bastille from the Alcatraz series. But again, I found this book series good enough that I still wanted to read everything in the series. I cared about the characters and where they were going, even if I didn't love or even like some of the main characters. I read Elantris next, which I loved. It had elements of the movie Ben-Hur with the Valley of the Lepers in it. There were just a lot of really, really good elements in that. I love the trope of the hopeful and ultimately good hero who's flawed but still overcomes a lot. I actually just found it a really good book. My husband got really annoyed with the narration because I think there's a repetition of the word, hey, Sully, which he found really annoying, but I kind of got over that. So I like that book. I think that was my first experience of, no, actually it wasn't my first experience, but it was the first time I really took notice of the Sanderlanche. I had definitely noticed in all of the Mistborn novels that the climax of the novels, they frequently came together really well and sort of pulled together all the loose threads. And even if things were like slow going or not so strong towards the middle section, the end was always very, very strong. I think Elantris was one where I really, really noticed that I was getting punched in the face with this amazing climax. And I think maybe that's where I started seeing the word Sanderlanche around, not sure. Then I read the Alcatraz series, which I thought were okay, but I didn't love. I was hoping that they would be something that might be, as good as Harry Potter. There were moments that I found very clever and funny. I always wanted to keep reading the series, but I found Alcatraz himself to be a bit of a snot, and I found Bastille a little bit annoying in the same way that a number of Sanderson's main female characters are. He seems to be better at writing supporting female characters, if that makes sense. Anyway, I really enjoyed them, and although there were some very jarring moments that were, I would say, quite dark and adult for a kid's series, they were good. And Harry Potter itself turned pretty dark from book 3 onwards, so it's not like kids' stories are always light and fluffy with fairies. After Alcatraz, I read Warbreaker, which I enjoyed a lot. The romance between Ciri and the God King was a bit meh to me, and I found the two of them a little bit boring, although there were some funny bits between them. I was very intrigued by Vivenna and Vasha, and I loved Lightsong. Again, in that novel, I probably would have enjoyed having more supporting female characters that were sympathetic. Siri was a little bit frustrating at times. Vivenna seemed a bit selfish, although she came along. But overall, I thought it was a good book. It had a really interesting, intriguing opening. There were so many strange descriptions of magic that I found fascinating. Nightblood was hilariously terrifying, and the returned were scary and unsettling, and overall it was just a really good book. When I was reading it, I was looking up various bits and pieces because sometimes I didn't quite get something and I'd look it up, and that's when I realised, oh, okay, so this book is an important cornerstone of the cosmere, so, try to pay attention. So I was trying to pay attention. When The Lost Metal came out, that's when I really started feeling that I was missing out on things because I hadn't read the Stormlight Archive. Everyone had always said these books are standalone. That's why I kind of tackled them first, because I thought, I'm not sure I'm ready to go for something like the Stormlight Archive, which isn't even finished yet. But that's when I really started noticing that I kept seeing the character of Hoyd everywhere, especially given his prominent role in Warbreaker. I realised that it was going to be just a matter of time before I needed to read the Stormlight Archive. Somewhere in there I started reading Tress, and I remember that I could get that he was going for a Princess Bride vibe, and I did like it, and I like the elements that he often has in his books, which is pulling together a motley crew and making people better versions of themselves than they might otherwise have been. But even though I've got no issue with reading young adult or even children's books, there was almost a slightly, I don't know how to put it, patronising tone to that book that I didn't love the first time I read it. And again, I felt like I think I'm missing out on a whole bunch of things because, here's Hoyd again, and there's all these references to things that I don't understand. So after I read Tress, I thought I definitely need to read the Stormlight Archive, because I'm really at the point where I feel like there's all these winks and nods to things, and even though he hasn't finished the Stormlight Archive yet, I think I'm just going to have to dive in. Oh my god. So I started The Way of Kings in mid-March 2022, and I remember the prologue, and I was thinking, wow, this is really alien to me. I remember reading about Kalak walking through the landscape and seeing everything, and thinking this is a really strange opening and not quite what I was expecting. And then I don't know, I just kept going. I was reading with my eyes, and I was also listening to the audio book, and it was interesting, but I wasn't pulled in. I don't know. What happened was that book kind of came and got me by the throat and pulled me in. So I won't go into it in detail yet because I might do another post just about that book. But all I can say is most way through that book, I was totally in. I told my husband, I think I'm a full-on Brandon Sanderson fan because this book is amazing. It's been a really long time since I've read a book that has kind of reached out and made me feel this obsessed in such a long time. So I finished it on the 28th of March, but I deliberately put off reading the next book because I just wanted to stay and linger in The Way of Kings for a little while, which is really unusual because I'm normally about instant gratification. I'm the sort of person that if I find a book I like, I will go out and I will try to read every single book by that author immediately. And so I had Words of Radiance and I knew I wanted to read it, but I thought there's so much still to process about The Way of Kings. And there were just so many things that I loved about it, and I just wanted to know more. So even though I'd finished it, I held off a little bit, listened to a whole bunch of booktubers, read a lot online, reread a few chapters, did that sort of stuff. Nonetheless, I couldn't put off much longer, so I read Words of Radiance, and I finished that on the 11th of April. And I would say that my level of enjoyment of Words of Radiance equaled, if not exceeded, how I felt about Way of Kings. I think the only reason Words of Radiance isn't sort of clearly better was just because Way of Kings was my intro into the Stormlight Archive, and it was just so startling and eye-opening that I'm not sure anything else will ever be able to match that. But Words of Radiance had so more amazing scenes. it took a bunch of characters that I originally might not have liked so much. Like, for instance, Shalon, I didn't have much time for her in Way of Kings. I really started liking her in Words of Radiance. Same with Adeline. I really didn't like Adeline in Way of Kings much, but he really grew on me in Words of Radiance. So I finished that on the 11th of April. I then finished Edge Dancer on the 15th of April. And I'd been a little bit ho-hum on Lift. I'd kind of skimmed through her interlude chapters in The Way of Kings or Words of Radiance. I can't remember which novel it was, but she had some interlude chapters. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, cute and quirky. I'd say half to most of Edge Dancer, I was a bit ho-hum about her. But there was a really good Sanderlanche in Edge Dancer. And by the end of Edge Dancer, I was a full-on Lift fan. I really, really liked her. I really wanted to know more about her. And I think I've heard some people saying, what was the point of Edge Dance? There was a point, and I loved it. Oathbringer, I was nervous about, just because there had been enough things thrown out in the books and also on YouTube and on the internet generally about how Dalinar had been a really bad person. So I was really worried going into it that it was going to be a book that would make me not like someone that I really, really liked. So I was pretty apprehensive going into that. But I'm okay. I feel like there was a good payoff. I should have just trusted Brandon Sanderson on this because I really liked Oathbringer. I would say that I didn't like it as much as Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. Not because it was a bad book or badly written, but just because for me it was so heavy and the pacing was probably fine, actually. I'm not going to criticize the pacing. It's probably just the subject matter. So I felt like there was a lot more positivity in The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. And there was a lot of darkness in Oathbringer. And even though it was resolved to my satisfaction, those chapters were really hard to get through. Even though I knew that Dalinar had been the Blackthorn and what he had done, to live through those moments with him and, you know, his alcoholism and self-destructiveness was actually very painful. It was probably offset by the Sanderlanche, which was amazing. But I also loved the development of all the other characters, and I loved Lift and Seth in that. So there were a whole bunch of elements in that that still made me really, really love that book. It's just that there were some heavy moments in it that made me really sad. So that's why it's probably, you know, Words of Radiance, Way of Kings, and then Oathbringer. But it's a very, very close second or third. So I finished Oathbringer on the 22nd of April. Dawnshard I finished on the 25th of April. That was a pretty quick gallop through because even though it was an interesting story and I did find it quite fascinating, the way Sanderson wrote about Risen, I wasn't a huge fan of the main character or the supporting characters in that. So normally I'll love something as long as, you know, I might not like the main, but I like the supporting or vice versa. In this particular one, I was kind of ho-hum about all of them. I didn't dislike them, but it was like, it wasn't a compelling read because I guess I'm very much a character-driven person. So I need at least one character that I really, really like in order to be able to really love a book. But I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating to find out more about the world. I did feel like Sanderson lacked a little bit of subtlety in this one because I felt like his exploration of mental health had been, okay, maybe it wasn't subtle, but it was very much deftly woven into the world in a way that wasn't preachy. And I did feel like Dawnshard was almost like a treatise on ableism, and I felt like I was being hit over the head with it. It wasn't as deft and subtle as some of his other works have been, but I still enjoyed it. So I finished Dawnshard on the 25th of April, and I really was trying so hard to slow myself down because I thought, oh crap, Rhythm of War is the last one we've got out. We're not going to get another Stormlight Archive book until sometime in 2024. You know, if I read this now, I won't have anything left. But I'm weak, and I let myself read it, and these are my reasons. Because I thought, okay, even if I finish it, and that's the last book, there's there's so much I can still do. Like, I will go back and I will reread everything, so that will keep me occupied. And there's also so much discussion on Reddit, and I'll be able to watch all of the YouTube videos. So I told myself, okay, I'm allowed to read book 4, even if I get horribly cliffhangered. So I galloped through it and I read it, finished it on the 28th of April. I have a very bad habit of racing through books when I read with my eyes. So I can read quite quickly, but I feel like I'm not capturing as much as I should have. So when I was reading Stormlight Archive, well, actually not just Stormlight Archive, Brandon Sanderson's books generally, I prefer to read as much of them as I can with audiobooks so I can slow myself down and really absorb the words. The good thing about that is that the audiobooks mean that I can also listen to them when I'm cooking, baking, driving, walking, just doing chores. And then I can pick up with my eyes at different times. I've managed to sort of keep that through most of the other books, but I have to say that for Rhythm of War, there were some really tedious chapters. I think a lot of people, like me, are kind of, okay, it's interesting to get the perspective of the Pashendi, but they're not that interesting. And Venli is not that interesting a character, and Ashonai is okay, but also not fascinating. And so there were huge chunks of that book that were dedicated to Venli and the Pashendi. So I sort of found that I was almost skimming and reading over those with my eyes. The other thing is that while the Die Hard action was happening at Urithiru, we all knew that what Dalinar and Yasna were doing elsewhere was basically them just being distracted, and it wasn't really the main game. And so I did find on my first read that that wasn't that interesting. So unfortunately, there were huge chunks of this book where I honestly found myself thinking, I need to get to the main game. I'm not quite bored, but I'm not as invested. Then there's a whole thing about Navani and Raboniel that I really didn't like. I read them, but I hated certain elements, which I will rant about in a separate post, I think. Overall, I know I sound very critical of Rhythm of War, but I really, really liked certain parts of it, and I really, really disliked certain parts of it, and I was incredibly bored by other parts of it. So I felt like people were being Brandon Sanderson apologists when they were going, oh, I didn't like it so much, but it was still a really good book. But here I am saying, oh, I didn't really like some parts of it, and it wasn't as good as the others, or I didn't enjoy it as much as the others, but it's still a really good book. And yep, that's actually how I feel. So as part of my reread, I will be rereading this one, and I'm sure it'll be much better on a second read. But for me, it has been my least favourite of the 4 so far. So I'm going to finish this first post, which has ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be, with a defence of Brandon Sanderson that, given his popularity and success, he does not need, but which I feel the need to make. As someone who is now an unabashed and unashamed fan of Brandon Sanderson's writing, particularly the Stormlight Archive, having read as much as I have on the internet now, I am incredibly tired of his own fans bashing Brandon Sanderson's prose. Don't get me wrong, I am totally okay with people not liking his work and not wanting to read it, and therefore critiquing it. Get that? I can also understand why it might be incredibly annoying for them if they really dislike him and his work, to have it constantly thrown in their faces and recommended to him. He's very ubiquitous, he's very popular. So that would be really annoying. So there's a category of people that just don't like his work and just don't want a bar of him. So totally get why they bash. That's fine. I'm also okay with people who don't like his writing style, but go, look, I like it anyway. That's fine. Like, that's okay. The category of fan that I really dislike are the ones who essentially imply that they are slumming it and lowering themselves by being a fan. It's almost like they feel like they need to be apologetic for liking his work. You know, they're like, oh, even though his prose isn't like Shakespeare or Tolkien or George R. R. Martin or Rothfuss, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, they'll say things like, oh, he's good at world building and magic systems. That's why I lower my erudite, exalted self to slide into the creme and read this pulp fiction. I find that strange. I don't think Brandon Sanderson is a guilty pleasure. Like, people kind of disparage his works. Like, some of his fans will disparage his works and say he's like a popcorn blockbuster, like the MCU or something like that. Actually, note to self, I really dislike it when people compare Cosmere to the MCU, partly because I find the MCU very bloated, very unstructured, and I just don't like it very much, even though I've watched a lot of the movies. So I actually feel like we're doing the Cosmere a bit of a disservice by comparing it to the MCU, but I totally get that that's the most accessible point at which that you can, describe the Cosmere to other people, but I wish there was a better way to do it. But anyway, as I was saying just then, there are fans like me who are totally fine with liking his works. We're very open, unabashed about enjoying them. And then there are the ones who are almost ashamed and embarrassed, like it's a guilty pleasure or something. And I'm judging those fans. These are judgy eyes that are looking at them, because those sorts of fans, they're actually showing how narrow and poorly educated they are. They think that by disparaging Sanderson's works, that's actually showing how erudite and scholarly they are. But it shows that they think there's only one good style of writing, and that means to be, a good writer of prose, you have to be relatively opaque and mysterious, chock full of metaphors and allegories and dense prose that you've got to wade your way through to figure out whether or not the character's opening a literal door or a metaphorical one. I've honestly never seen the same level of self-deprecating, oh, I read his work, but because I'm smart, I realise that I'm slumming it and I'm capable of reading much more complex work too. So many Sanderson fans always feel the need to preface their love of his work with saying, yeah, I like his work and his world building and his magic systems, but his prose is really bad. He admits it himself. It's like they're all classical English majors who can pass judgment definitively on what's good and bad prose. Not that Sanderson cares, but I feel really bad for Sanderson that his work is being judged so harshly by so many against what I consider only one aspect of what makes up good writing. I definitely think that speaks to the reader who just is not secure enough in themselves to say, I enjoy this piece of work. I've seen this guilty pleasure stuff amongst young adult readers and romance readers, and also to a certain extent crime mystery readers. It's really, really common in those circles to be a little bit embarrassed about it. It's like, oh, it's guilty pleasure. I read trash, but it's fun. And, you'll see those people rationalize it by going, I've got a stressful job or blah, blah. I do it myself, and I will balance what I read. I'll read some worthy stuff and then I'll let myself read some really light and fluffy romance. But I no longer feel guilty or ashamed about it. I do not feel in any way that this makes me less of a person, less intelligent, less discerning. I'm just reading a lot of different things, and that's okay. But it's really interesting in the Sanderson fandom because they feel much more compelled to voraciously read and enjoy his work, but then denigrate it. For different reasons, I guess. Like, overall, it's probably because he's a much more positive writer than grimdark. And also, as I've mentioned before, he writes very clean prose rather than tangled and convoluted prose. One of the reasons for my frustration is that I think that many people mistakenly equate or conflate a much more adorned and flowery writing style as being better writing. That's fine. It's a style. If that's what you like, then read it. If you want to read Rothfuss or Martin, Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Steinbeck or classics, go and read them. That's fine. They're good. It doesn't mean that because a piece of writing isn't accessible, it doesn't mean it's good. People like belonging to an elite club. No one likes a club that everyone can join. Then it's not a club, right? You want it to be, members only, invite only. So I feel like a lot of people think that more inaccessible writing is more elite and more intellectual and academic. If you can read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in its original form and not its translated English form, you are therefore smarter. If you can read Shakespeare and understand it, you are therefore smarter than someone who can't read Shakespeare. It's not really the case. And then it's just a different type of writing and a different type of enjoyment. For me personally, the reason I like Sanderson's writing is that it is so immersive. I know that's a very trite and glib statement that a lot of people have said about his works before. But what I mean is that when I'm reading his works, I think his writing is effective because I honestly forget that I'm sitting at my desk, on the sofa, lying in my bed reading his book. I am there in world. I find, for me personally, if it's a good book, I find a good book even more immersive than a movie because I feel like I'm there in world. Maybe I'm not interacting with the characters, but I'm surrounded on all sides by the characters that he's created and described. And for me, it's like a setting in which I can walk around, pick up things, look at them, examine them. It really reminds me of when I watched The Force Awakens for the first time and I saw Rey going around an abandoned Star Destroyer on Jakku. I immediately wished that there was a VR mechanism to allow me to do the same thing, because when I saw that ship and Jakku itself with its graveyard of starships, it looked so fascinating to me that I wish that I could go there and look at it all myself. I find that Sanderson's writing allows me to do that. It's detailed enough that I can go into a scene and explore different things and look at them, but I can also just absorb his narrative and what he's saying. For a lot of other writers, even though I really enjoy reading their work and their descriptions, I'm not there. It's always me sitting here and reading about the experiences and observations of someone else. Like, I'm not in world. It's very much, you're there, I'm here, I'm reading it. It's really interesting, but it's more academic. When I read a Sanderson book, particularly Stormlight Archive, I'm not just reading about his travel adventures. I'm not there too. So while I'm not a literary major, I can't help thinking that that has to get some sort of recognition as being a type of excellent writing, because it's not every author that can invite you into that world and not just describe it to you, but also make you see it and feel it as well. And I get that some people want the experience of having the spaceship that transports them to this other world as being like the BMW or Mercedes of spaceships and full of fancy trappings and velvet seats and all that kind of stuff. But I'm actually, me personally, I'm really happy to be catapulted from here to there in a matter of seconds and not really care about what spaceship's taking me there, but I just want to be there. So in my mind, while it might not tick all of the boxes about what all different types of good writing could be, it certainly ticks the box of, is this author able to convey what he or she is trying to tell me? I do agree with his, window analogy that he's deliberately writing in a way that pulls you into the story, allows him to tell the story without being distracted by extraneous things. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind people criticising his work. I do it myself. I'll tell you that I feel like his female characters can frequently be a little bit less compelling, or I'll say that he really doesn't like romance very well. I don't mean, he's not so great, but it's very pulpy and therefore that's why I like it, but I'm actually much smarter, so you need to respect me because I can denigrate what I'm reading. Because to be honest, when people say that to me, I just chalk it up to brag bingo. And I consider that a brag. I don't consider that a critique of Sanderson's works. I consider that a mark of the reader being insecure, not able to be proud and secure of the works that they enjoy. And I actually think they must be pretty dumb if they spend so much time reading something that they think is beneath them. I mean, what a waste of time. Reading something like the Stormlight Archive is a massive investment of time and energy. And if you're going to read it, even though you think it's beneath you, I think that shows that you're the dumbo, not Sanderson. Anyway, this was my very rambly, self-opinionated post. I'm intending to do some others because I do have a few unpopular opinions that I want to discuss. I have felt a bit apprehensive trying to discuss on other people's fora. For instance, why I used to love Navani a lot, and then come Rhythm of War, I kind of dislike her a lot. And I want to talk about other elements of the books, but we'll see whether I get that. But I really wanted to do this post just because after finishing Rhythm of War and everything, I had so many feelings that I wanted to make sure I captured so that at a later point in time I could remember what it was like to discover his works for the first time, how much I love them, and how many hopes I have for his future books.